The checkpoint smelled like cigarette smoke and wet wool. It was the 16th of December, 1944, somewhere on a road outside Awale, Belgium, and a jeep had just rolled to a stop in the frozen mud at 2 in the morning. There were 3 men in the jeep. They were wearing American uniforms. They had American weapons, American dog tags, American cigarettes in their pockets. Their papers were good. Their English was good. 2 of them had spent time in the United States before the war, and their accents were, in ordinary conversation, indistinguishable from the real thing. The military policeman on duty that night was cold and tired, and had been standing at this checkpoint for 6 hours. He had stopped perhaps 40 vehicles since sundown. He waved the jeep forward in the usual way and leaned into the window and asked the driver a question, not about the papers, not about the unit designation on the bumper, not about the orders folded in the breast pocket. He asked about baseball. Specifically, he asked who played shortstop for the Detroit Tigers. The driver knew a great many things. He knew the frequencies of American field radios. He knew the call signs of 3 American Army Corps. He knew where the fuel depots were, where the ammunition was staged, where the bridges over the Meuse River were lightly guarded, and where they were not. He had been briefed for weeks on exactly this kind of moment. He did not know who played shortstop for the Detroit Tigers. What happened next would end with the driver and his 2 passengers in front of a firing squad, and it would unravel, piece by piece, the most audacious special operation the German military had attempted in the entire war. A plan conceived by one man, approved personally by Hitler, and built on a premise so simple it was almost invisible. That in the chaos of a collapsing front, an enemy soldier looks exactly like a friend. The man who designed that plan was not in the jeep. He was somewhere else entirely, watching something much larger than 3 men in a stolen vehicle. His name was Otto Skorzeny. Parte Primera, O Homem que Roubou Mussolini, Part 1, The Man Who Stole Mussolini. Otto Skorzeny was 35 years old in the autumn of 1943, and he was already a problem that the German High Command did not quite know what to do with. He was Austrian, born in Vienna on the 12th of June 1908, which made him a fellow countryman of Hitler's, though the 2 men had almost nothing else in common. Skorzeny was 2 meters tall, broad through the shoulders, with a scar running from his left cheekbone to his jaw that he had received in a student dueling society at the University of Vienna. He had studied engineering. Before the war, he had been in business. He had a wife, children, a life that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. He had volunteered for the Waffen-SS in 1939 and discovered, rapidly, that conventional soldiering bored him. He wanted the edge cases. He wanted the problems that had no solution in the field manual. In September of 1943, Mussolini had been deposed by the Italian government, arrested and imprisoned. First in a location unknown to the Germans, then, through a chain of intelligence work that took most of the summer, tracked to a ski hotel called Campo Imperatore, 900 meters up in the Apennines, accessible only by cable car. Hitler wanted Mussolini back. He assigned the rescue to Skorzeny. What followed was not elegant. Skorzeny landed gliders on a mountain meadow that was not large enough for gliders, in a raid that the paratroopers who planned it regarded as borderline suicidal, and walked out of Campo Imperatore with Mussolini alive in under 10 minutes. No Italian guards were killed. The hotel's general manager, an Italian officer named Guelli, was so stunned by the arrival of 12 gliders and 90 men that he simply did not order his garrison to fire. Skorzeny became, overnight, the most famous soldier in Germany. The newspapers called him the most dangerous man in Europe. He found the epithet useful. Stop and think about what this meant for the German war machine in 1943. The Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. Stalingrad had happened. North Africa had happened. The Italian peninsula was now a front. The German public needed heroes of a specific type. Not the grinding, anonymous heroism of the Eastern Front, but spectacular, individual, cinematic heroism. Skorzeny was exactly that. And Hitler, who understood the propaganda value of spectacle better than almost any other leader of his era, kept Skorzeny close. By October of 1944, Skorzeny had run 2 more major operations. He had commanded the seizure of the Hungarian government's headquarters in Budapest, Operation Panzerfaust, when the Hungarian regent Miklós Horthy attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Soviets. Skorzeny had Horthy's son kidnapped, rolled tanks up to the government palace, and forced the regent to abdicate within hours. The operation was brutal, improvised, and completely successful. He had also, earlier in 1944, been assigned to capture Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia. That operation, Rosselsprung, Knight's Move, had failed, and Skorzeny was frank about why. The intelligence was stale, the paratroopers arrived to find Tito already gone, and the whole thing dissolved into a conventional ground engagement that accomplished nothing except killing Germans. Hold that failure in your mind. It matters for what comes next. Because by November of 1944, Skorzeny was sitting across a desk from Hitler at Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's command bunker in East Prussia, and being handed the most ambitious special operations mission of the entire war. Hitler had a plan. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The American and British armies had been advancing since June. They were now approaching the German border. The German economy was being bombed into rubble. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Hitler's plan was to concentrate every available armoured reserve in the West, drive them through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, the same route Germany had used in 1940 and in 1914, punch through the thin Allied lines, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. If Antwerp fell, the Allied supply chain would be severed. The British and American armies would be split. A negotiated peace might be possible. It was, as almost every German general around him understood, a fantasy. The fuel didn't exist. The manpower didn't exist. The air cover didn't exist. But Hitler believed it, and so it would happen. Skorzeny's role was a subsidiary operation called Greif, Griffin. He would take a unit of English-speaking German soldiers, dress them in American uniforms, equip them with American vehicles, and send them behind Allied lines. Their mission, as Hitler outlined it, had two components. The first component was tactical. 4 teams of commandos in jeeps would race ahead of the German armoured advance, reach the Meuse bridges before the Americans could demolish them, and hold them open for the German tanks. The second component was psychological. The commandos would cut communications lines, change road signs, misdirect traffic, spread false orders, and generally create the impression that German infiltrators were everywhere, that no American soldier could trust any other American soldier, any vehicle, any uniform, any checkpoint. It was the second component that Skorzeny himself believed in. The first, he privately thought, was impossible. He was right, and he knew it before the operation began. Part 2. The gap between what Hitler ordered and what Skorzeny built. Skorzeny received his orders in late October of 1944. He had approximately 6 weeks to build a unit capable of executing them. Hitler's directive was specific. He wanted a brigade-strength formation, roughly 3,500 men, all fluent English speakers, equipped with captured American vehicles and weapons, capable of operating independently behind Allied lines for days at a time. Skorzeny began recruiting immediately. He sent a request through Wehrmacht channels for soldiers with English language proficiency. What came back was, by his own account in his post-war memoirs, a catastrophe. He received, ultimately, approximately 150 men with any genuine English fluency. Of those, perhaps 10 could pass as native speakers under sustained conversation. Perhaps 40 could manage a brief checkpoint encounter if the questions were simple. The rest, over 100 men, had classroom English, textbook English, the kind of English that sounded like a translation. The vehicles were worse. Hitler had promised American tanks, American trucks, American jeeps. The Wehrmacht's captured vehicle pool was, in reality, a collection of worn-out, damaged or mechanically unreliable machines. Skorzeny received, in the end, 2 Sherman tanks that had been repainted with American markings, but the repainting was visibly incomplete, and the Shermans were German-modified versions that an American tanker would have identified as wrong within 30 seconds. He received approximately 15 Jeeps in varying states of repair. He received several American trucks and a handful of other vehicles. He did not receive 3,500 men. He received, in total, a unit of approximately 150 combat-capable infiltrators and perhaps 600 additional men who could serve in a conventional supporting role but could not pass as American soldiers. Here is the forensic detail that changes everything. Skorzeny knew by mid-November that the bridge capture mission was impossible. He did not have the men, the vehicles, or the English fluency to seize and hold bridges over the Meuse in the face of American resistance. He wrote this in his operational assessment. He communicated it through channels. And then, because he was Skorzeny, because the operation was happening regardless, because Hitler had personally ordered it, he proceeded. He restructured Greif into what it could actually accomplish. The bridge teams, called Einheit Stielau, after their commander, Hauptmann Adrian von Volkersam, were reduced to 10 jeep teams, 4 men each, 40 men total. Their mission was no longer to seize bridges. Their mission was infiltration, disruption, intelligence gathering, and, most critically, the creation of fear. Meet Hauptmann Adrian von Volkersam, 31 years old, born in Riga in what was then the Russian Empire, the son of a Baltic German family with a centuries-long military tradition. He spoke Russian, Latvian, German, and English, not the English of a native speaker, but the English of someone who had lived alongside English speakers. He had run behind Soviet lines operations in the Caucasus in 1942, disguised as a Soviet NKVD officer, and had come back alive. He was, of all the men in Skorzeny's unit, the one most likely to succeed in what they were attempting. Von Volkersam trained his 40 men for 3 weeks. They memorized American military slang. They practiced driving American vehicles. They studied American unit insignia, pay grades, command structures. They learned the names of American generals: Eisenhower, Bradley, Hodges, Patton. They studied American newspapers for cultural references. They did not study baseball, or rather, they studied it the way you study something you will be tested on, not the way you absorb something you have lived inside. They knew the names of some teams. They knew that there was a World Series. They did not know the texture of the thing, the arguments, the statistics, the inherited loyalties that American men carried the way they carried their blood type. This is the gap. This is where Operation Greif was always going to break. But before we get to the checkpoints, we need to understand what was happening on the American side of the line. The Ardennes offensive began at 5:30 in the morning on the 16th of December 1944. 3 German armies, the 6th Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army, struck along an 85-mile front. The attack hit 4 American divisions: the 4th Infantry Division in the south, the 28th Infantry Division in the center, the 106th Infantry Division in the north, and the 14th Cavalry Group covering the Schnee Eifel. These units were either recovering from previous fighting or had never seen serious combat. They were, in the language of the American command, a quiet sector. 80,000 German soldiers hit them in the first wave. The front shattered. Hold that number. 80,000 men in the first wave against approximately 83,000 Americans spread across 85 miles. The math was brutal. The 106th Infantry Division, largely men who had arrived in Europe only weeks before, was encircled within 2 days. 8,863 men surrendered on the 19th of December. It was the largest mass surrender of American soldiers since the Civil War. Into this chaos, Skorzeny's jeep teams crossed the line. Part 3. 40 men in American uniforms. The jeep teams crossed into American lines on the morning of the 16th of December, moving with the general confusion of the offensive's opening hours. They were not a coordinated wave. They were individual 4-man cells, each with a specific assignment, each operating independently. The teams that crossed successfully, and not all of them did, at least 2 teams were stopped at the German line of departure by their own side's confusion, drove American jeeps, wore American uniforms, carried American weapons, and had American identification papers prepared by German forgers. The papers were good, genuinely good. The American counterintelligence officers who later examined captured examples rated them as among the best forgeries they had encountered in the war. What the teams did in the first 24 to 48 hours was, by any objective measure, remarkably effective. They changed road signs. They cut telephone lines. They rerouted convoys. In at least 3 documented cases, they stopped American vehicles and sent them in the wrong direction by displaying what appeared to be legitimate orders. One team, operating near Meuse, is believed to have redirected an entire battalion supply convoy for several hours. And they talked to American soldiers, at checkpoints, at roadblocks, at fuel depots. Brief conversations, kept short by design. The teams had been trained to keep encounters to under 2 minutes. Get through fast, answer the minimum, drive on. For the first day, it worked. Then, on the 17th of December, 3 members of Einheit Stielau were captured near Eiweiler, Belgium. Their jeep had been stopped at a routine checkpoint. One of the men, and here the historical record is specific, gave an answer to a routine question about his unit's destination that contradicted the unit patch on his shoulder. The checkpoint sergeant, a man from the 32nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, noticed. He detained them for further questioning. Under interrogation, the 3 men, their names were Günther Billing, Wilhelm Schmidt, and Manfred Pernas, broke within hours. They were not trained intelligence operatives. They were Wehrmacht soldiers given a mission that required skills they had never developed. Under sustained questioning by American counterintelligence, they told everything. Everything. They named Skorzeny. They described the mission. They described the target, the Meuse bridges, and they described, or implied, or allowed American interrogators to infer, a mission that was far larger than it actually was. Operation Greif's real success began at that precise moment, not from what the jeep teams did, from what the prisoners said under questioning. The American interrogators heard the name Skorzeny and processed it through what they knew about Skorzeny, which was, he was the most dangerous commando in Europe, he had rescued Mussolini from an impossible situation, he had seized the Hungarian government in a single morning. When the prisoners said there was a mission involving American uniforms and Meuse bridges, the interrogators did not hear 40 men in 10 jeeps. They heard the most dangerous man in Europe with an unknown number of men targeting our bridges and possibly our command structure. The gap between those 2 things, what Greif actually was and what American intelligence now believed it was, became the most effective weapon Skorzeny ever deployed. Think about that. The men in the jeeps were the distraction. The prisoners were the operation. Within hours of the Aval capture, a rumor was moving through the American command structure. It had the specific gravity of a rumor that contains enough truth to feel real. Skorzeny had a team targeting Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander was the objective. German commandos in American uniforms were going to assassinate the general who commanded all Allied forces in Europe. There is no evidence that this was ever Skorzeny's mission. Skorzeny himself denied it for the rest of his life, and the operational documents that have been recovered, fragmentary as they are, do not support it. The assassination mission appears to have been an inference that American intelligence made from the combination of Skorzeny's name, the existence of men in American uniforms, and the general chaos of an offensive that had already shattered 3 divisions. But the rumor was running now, and it was going to run for weeks. The mid-roll, because this is the moment to stop. Men like Wilhelm Schmidt and Manfred Pernas were not spies. They were clerks and truck drivers and warehouse workers who had been handed a mission that required a lifetime of American culture they had never had. They broke under questioning not because they were weak, but because the interrogators were asking them about things, places, names, slang, sport that they had only ever studied, never lived. And the gap between studying something and living inside it is exactly the gap that the American sentries at every checkpoint in Belgium were now trained to find. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what happened in those frozen weeks in December, not the version in the official histories, but the version that the soldiers on both sides experienced in real time, hit the like button. It keeps this story visible a little longer. Part 3 continued. The checkpoint becomes a weapon. By the 18th of December, SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, had issued an alert. The text of the alert described German soldiers in American uniforms, operating in American jeeps, with possible missions including bridge seizure, communications disruption, and assassination of senior commanders. The response was immediate, and from the perspective of the German offensive's operational goals, almost perfectly counterproductive for the Americans themselves. Every checkpoint in the American rear area became a potential security crisis. Every American soldier was now a potential German infiltrator. The procedure that emerged, improvised over a period of about 48 hours, was simple. When in doubt, ask something that a German couldn't know. The questions that emerged were not from any intelligence manual. They were from the lived experience of the men running the checkpoints. Men from Ohio, from Georgia, from Massachusetts, from California. The questions they asked were the questions whose answers they had grown up knowing, without knowing they knew them. Who plays center field for the Brooklyn Dodgers? What is the capital of Illinois? Who is Betty Grable married to? What is the infield fly rule? Name the American League teams. Who won the World Series in 1942? These were not trick questions. They were not obscure questions. For an American man in his 20s in 1944, these questions were like asking someone their mother's name. The answers were simply there, absorbed through years of newspapers and radio broadcasts and arguments in diners and schoolyards. For a German soldier who had spent 3 weeks memorizing American military slang, they were catastrophic. The capital of Illinois. Every German soldier who had studied American geography had learned that the major cities were New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. The capital of Illinois, therefore, was Chicago. The correct answer is Springfield. At least a dozen documented checkpoint incidents in the week following the A-Way capture involved this question, and in several cases, it was the question that stopped a vehicle. Betty Grable. She was the most famous pin-up of the American military. Her photograph was in more army barracks than any other image. Her husband, as of 1943, was Harry James, the bandleader. German intelligence had her name. They did not necessarily have her husband's name, and more importantly, they did not have the casual, automatic way that an American soldier would have said it, the way you say the name of someone whose marriage has been in every newspaper for months. The infield fly rule. This one is almost cruel. The infield fly rule is one of the more arcane regulations in baseball, governing what happens when a batter hits a catchable pop fly with runners on first and second, or with the bases loaded and fewer than 2 outs. American men who had never played organized baseball beyond a schoolyard game knew the infield fly rule the way they knew how a traffic light worked. German soldiers who had studied baseball from a translated rulebook did not know it the way it needed to be known, fluently, automatically, without thinking. What the history books often miss is the forensic detail. The checkpoint questions were not standardized. There was no official list. Different sentries asked different questions based on what they happened to care about. A sentry from Boston might ask about the Red Sox. A sentry from St. Louis might ask about the Cardinals. A sentry who had grown up listening to Jack Benny on the radio might ask about Jack Benny's running gags. A sentry who had played high school football might ask about NFL teams or college rivalries. This randomness was, paradoxically, the most effective security measure imaginable. You cannot prepare for a question you don't know is coming. You can memorize the starting lineup of every Major League Baseball team, and then a sentry from rural Kentucky asks you about a local college football rivalry, and you have nothing. The German Jeep teams had been prepared for a specific set of questions. American sentries were not asking a specific set of questions. They were asking whatever felt natural to them. The result was a filter. An imperfect filter certainly. Some teams got through, and we'll come back to what they accomplished. but a filter that caught, over the course of the next 2 weeks, a significant number of the men Skorzeny had sent forward. And the men it caught did not just get arrested, they talked. Meet Pernas, Billing and Schmidt again, because their individual fates matter and are documented. Manfred Pernas was 23 years old, born in Gleiwitz in Silesia. Before the war, he had worked in his father's small manufacturing business. He spoke English at roughly the level of a European businessman, functional, accented, not fluent. Wilhelm Schmidt was 26, from Dusseldorf, the import office clerk. Günther Billing was 24, from Stuttgart, and had the best English of the three. He had spent a year before the war working for a German company with British clients. All three were tried by American military tribunal in December of 1944. The charge was operating behind enemy lines in enemy uniform, a violation of the laws of war. The trial lasted 2 days. All three were convicted. All three were executed by firing squad on the 23rd of December 1944 at Henri-Chapelle, Belgium. They were shot in their American uniforms. Stop and hold that image. 3 men in their mid-20s shot in the uniforms of a country that was not theirs for a mission that had already failed before they crossed the line. The mission they died for had been restructured from its original concept because the resources promised never materialized. The bridges they were supposed to hold were never within reach. The army they were supposed to enable was already running out of fuel. They were 23, 24, 26 years old. Part 4. The forensic verdict. The forensic verdict of this investigation points to one conclusion. Operation Greif succeeded at exactly one thing, and it was not the thing it was designed to do. It did not seize the Meuse bridges. No bridge was seized. The bridges were never within reach of Skorzeny's actual forces, and Skorzeny had known this before the operation began. His post-war memoirs are clear on this point. He wrote, in the 1952 German edition, later translated into English, that he had told his superiors the bridge mission was impossible with the resources provided, and that he had restructured Greif accordingly. The primary objective of Operation Greif, as Hitler had defined it, was never attempted. It did not, in any meaningful military sense, disrupt the American advance. The road signs that were changed were corrected within hours. The columns that were misdirected found their way. The telephone lines that were cut were repaired or bypassed. The tactical damage done by 10 jeep teams over 2 weeks of operation was, by any honest accounting, negligible. What Greif did, and this is the part that Skorzeny understood and that has been underappreciated ever since, was generate a psychological effect completely disproportionate to its actual scale. Eisenhower was moved to a secure location and kept there for days. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe was effectively under house arrest because of a rumor generated by 40 men in American uniforms. He was, by his own account, furious about this. He wrote to his wife Mamie that he felt like a prisoner. He was 60 miles from the front, surrounded by guards, unable to move freely, because German intelligence had convinced American security services that he was a target. Reread that. The most powerful military commander in the Western world was neutralized, briefly but genuinely, by a psychological operation conducted by fewer men than you'd find in a large high school class. The traffic at every American checkpoint in Belgium and Luxembourg slowed to a crawl. Every vehicle was stopped, every soldier was questioned, every order was double-checked. The American rear area, which under normal circumstances was a relatively efficient logistical machine, spent approximately 2 weeks operating in a state of institutional paranoia. General Bruce Clark, commanding Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division during the defense of Saint-Vith, was himself detained at a checkpoint and subjected to questioning. He gave the wrong answer to a question about the Chicago Bears. He said they played in the National Football League's Eastern Division when they actually played in the Western Division. He was held for several hours before his identity was confirmed through other means. Clark was one of the key commanders holding the northern shoulder of the Bulge. His detention, even for hours, was not trivial. Think about what this means. The American military's own security measures, triggered by Greif, were detaining American generals. The baseball test, the football test, the Betty Grable test, these were catching genuine German infiltrators, but they were also catching Americans who happened not to know the answer to a specific question. Americans who were nervous because they'd been stopped at gunpoint. Americans whose accents or mannerisms or answers didn't fit the expectations of a particular sentry. The hidden cost of the psychological operation was structural. When you make everyone a potential enemy, you make your own side less efficient. The friction that Skorzeny introduced into the American rear area was not just the friction of German infiltrators, it was the friction of American soldiers treating each other with suspicion. Now let's account for the men. Of the 10 Jeep teams that crossed the line, 40 men total. The historical record is incomplete, but the best available accounting suggests the following. 3 men were captured at Awale on the 17th of December and executed. Additional team members were captured in subsequent days, with at least 8 more men confirmed as prisoners by the end of December. Some teams appear to have returned to German lines after completing their assigned disruption tasks. The fate of several individuals remains unclear in the historical record. Skorzeny himself never crossed the line in American uniform. He commanded the operation from the German side, and he later commanded the conventional follow-on force, the 151st Panzer Brigade, in a brief and unsuccessful conventional attack near Malmedy on the 21st of December. That attack was repulsed. Skorzeny was wounded, a shell fragment struck him near the eye, and the conventional force achieved nothing. The Ardennes offensive itself peaked on the 24th of December 1944. When the leading German armoured elements came within a few kilometres of the Meuse near Dinant, never actually reaching the river, and then stalled. Patton's Third Army, executing one of the most remarkable logistical pivots in military history, had turned 90 degrees north and was already attacking the southern flank of the German salient. The weather cleared on the 23rd, and Allied air power, which had been grounded by fog, returned to the battlefield. The German offensive was over. The army began retreating. The Meuse bridges that Greif was supposed to seize were never threatened, now the biographical arcs, because they matter. Adrian von Volkersam, the commander of Einheit Stielau, survived the war. He had not crossed the line himself, he commanded the training and preparation phase and some of the operational coordination. He died in 1945, but not from the war. He was killed in a vehicle accident in the final weeks of the fighting, somewhere on the Eastern Front, trying to get back to Germany ahead of the Soviet advance. He was 32 years old. Otto Skorzeny survived. He was captured by American forces in May of 1945 and held for trial at Nuremberg, not as a defendant in the main trial, but in subsequent proceedings. He was tried specifically for Operation Greif, charged with violation of the laws of war for using enemy uniforms. The prosecution argued that dressing soldiers in enemy uniforms constituted a war crime. The defense made a counter-argument that changed the outcome. Skorzeny's defense team produced testimony from a British commando officer, Colonel Forrest Yo Thomas, known as the White Rabbit, who had operated in occupied France, that the British had also used enemy uniforms in certain operations. The tribunal, faced with the prospect of establishing a precedent that would implicate Allied special operations as well, acquitted Skorzeny on the laws of war charge in September of 1947. He was held for a further period on other charges, escaped from an internment camp in 1948, walked out in an American officer's uniform, which was either deeply ironic or entirely predictable depending on your perspective, and eventually settled in Madrid under Franco's protection. He ran a business consulting firm. He was rumoured, with varying degrees of credibility, to have assisted in the escape of other former SS officers, and to have worked as a consultant for various intelligence services. He wrote his memoirs. He died in Madrid on the 5th of July 1975 at the age of 67. Prostate cancer. He maintained until his death that Operation Greif had been a success, not as a military operation, but as a psychological one. He was not wrong. The men who executed him, Pernas, Schmidt, Billing, were 23, 24, and 26 years old when they died. Pernas was from Gliwice, which after the war became the Polish city of Gliwice. The import office where Schmidt had worked in Dusseldorf was presumably bombed flat by the time he was shot. Billing's Stuttgart employers were, by December of 1944, operating under daily air raids. They had volunteered for a mission that their commander privately considered impossible in its original form. They were caught not by sophisticated counterintelligence, but by a sentry who noticed something wrong. A detail, a hesitation, a contradiction between a shoulder patch and a stated destination. They were questioned about things they had studied but never lived. They answered wrong. They were shot. The checkpoint question, the baseball question, the football question, the Betty Grable question worked not because it was clever. It worked because it was impossible to fake. You cannot memorize your way into a lifetime of American sport and popular culture in 3 weeks. You can learn the words. You cannot learn the way the words sit in a person's body, the way they come out without thought, the way an American soldier in 1944 would have said Harry James when asked about Betty Grable's husband, not because he had looked it up, but because it was simply there. The German military, which had built the finest tactical army in the world, which had developed Auftragstaktik, mission command doctrine, which had trained its officers to operate with initiative and judgment at every level of command, could not teach its soldiers to be American. Not in 6 weeks, not in 6 months, possibly not in 6 years. And the American military, which was in many respects a less sophisticated tactical organization, had a security advantage that no German general could have designed. Its soldiers were American. The checkpoints were not run by intelligence professionals. They were run by men from Ohio and Georgia and Massachusetts who asked the questions that were simply there, in the air between them, because those questions were what they knew. That is what stopped Greif. Not counterintelligence, not signals interception, not aerial reconnaissance. Baseball, football, Betty Grable's husband, the capital of Illinois. The things you know without knowing you know them. Now return to the beginning, December 1944. The Ardennes, a jeep moving through fog. Wilhelm Schmidt, 26 years old, in an American staff sergeant's uniform, with American papers and an American cigarette and 3 weeks of American English, comes to a stop at a checkpoint. The sentry, his name is not recorded in the documents that have survived, but he was there, somewhere in Belgium, somewhere in the cold, steps forward. He is young, he is cold. He has been told that German infiltrators are everywhere, that even generals have been stopped, that no uniform can be trusted. He asks his question. It is not about passwords, it is not about unit designations. And Schmidt, who knew cargo manifests and trade documents, who had memorized American military slang and the names of American generals, who had studied the thing but never lived inside it, Schmidt gives the wrong answer. The sentry raises his hand. The jeep stops. Operation Greif, which was designed to change the course of a battle, which was supposed to seize bridges over the Meuse and open the road to Antwerp, which was built on the premise that 40 men in the right uniforms could reshape a war, ends here. At a checkpoint, in the fog, because of a question about a sport. Skorzeny understood something important that his mission ultimately proved from the wrong direction. The deepest infiltration is not about uniforms or documents or vehicles. It is about the texture of a life. You can copy the surface of a culture. You cannot copy what the surface is made of. A fine disguise, but you have to know the answers. If this investigation gave you something new, nod at the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the most effective security measure in the Second World War's most famous infiltration operation was not designed by any intelligence agency. It was designed by decades of American boys arguing about baseball.